I walked into Vivian's office and said, "I'm here," even though it always felt like I was never really here to her. She didn't look up from her screen and replied, "Sit, Ethan, I'm finishing something." I told myself she's busy, not cold, even when my chest felt empty. I said, "You promised we would have dinner," and she answered, "We are having it, just later." I watched her eyes move across numbers instead of my face and thought I was dating the most powerful woman in the city, yet I felt invisible. I whispered, "I missed you," and she said, "I know." That was how Vivian Cross loved me, with words that sounded right but felt hollow. I tried to joke, "You always say that like a report," and she replied, "Feelings don't change facts." I laughed because I didn't want to cry. Sophie Lane walked in and said, "Miss Cross, the board is waiting." Vivian waved her away and said, "5 minutes." Sophie looked at me like she wanted to warn me about something but couldn't. I asked, "Do I make you late for everything?" Vivian said, "You make me human, which is worse for my schedule." I wanted to believe that meant something. When we left, I said, "Let's go home together," and she answered, "I'll follow you later." Later never felt like a promise. At our apartment, I cooked and said, "I made your favorite." She said, "You know I don't have favorites." I replied, "You love lemon pasta," and she said, "It's efficient." I tried again and said, "How was your day?" She said, "Productive." I waited for more, but that was all she gave me. Her phone buzzed and she flipped it face down. I asked, "Who is it?" She said, "Work." Her voice was steady but her eyes weren't. I said, "You talk about work more than you talk about me." She said, "Work keeps us alive." I whispered, "I thought we kept us alive." She looked at me like she was solving a problem and said, "Don't be dramatic." I told her, "I just want to feel wanted." She replied, "You are wanted, you are here." I said, "That's not the same." She checked her phone again and said, "I have to take this." I stood there feeling like a piece of furniture. When she finished, I asked, "Do you even miss me when I'm gone?" She said, "I notice when things change." That answer hurt more than silence. I said, "I love you." She said, "I appreciate you." Sophie texted me later and wrote, "Are you okay?" I typed, "Why are you asking?" She wrote, "Because you look like you're fading." I didn't reply. Vivian came out of the bedroom and said, "Did you pay the internet bill?" I said, "Yes, like always." She said, "Good." I wanted her to say thank you or my name or anything warm. I told her, "Today was my first day on the new project." She paused and said, "Right?" That was it. I said, "It mattered to me." She frowned and said, "You didn't remind me." I felt something crack inside my chest. I whispered, "I shouldn't have to remind you that I exist." She said, "Ethan, you know I'm under pressure." I replied, "I am too." She walked past me and said, "We will talk later." Later felt like never. I sat on the couch and said out loud, "I just want you to see me." She didn't answer. That was when I realized I was dating a woman who needed my loyalty but never needed my heart. I stood up and said, "Vivian, do you remember my birthday?" She paused and said, "It's in your file." I said, "It was yesterday." She stared at me silent. I laughed but it sounded broken. I said, "You forgot again." She tried to speak but no excuse came. I felt small and said, "That's the thing that hurts." She whispered, "I'm sorry." It was late and sorry felt thin, but it was all I had, so I took it and sat back down. I thought love should not feel like waiting alone in silence. I walked into Vivian's company and told the guard, "I'm here to surprise my girlfriend," and saying that out loud almost made me smile. I rode the elevator up and whispered, "Maybe today she will actually be happy to see me." When I stepped out, Sophie rushed toward me and said, "Ethan, you shouldn't go in there right now." I asked, "Why not?" She looked nervous and said, "She's in a meeting." I said, "I'm her boyfriend, not a client," and I kept walking. Sophie grabbed my arm and said, "Please just wait." I gently pulled away and replied, "I just want to see her." As I reached the meeting room, I heard laughter through the glass, and it wasn't the kind Vivian ever shared with me. I stopped and listened. A man's voice said, "You always act so serious, but I know you enjoy breaking rules." Vivian laughed softly and said, "Only with the right company." My stomach twisted because I recognized that voice. I whispered, "Damien Wolf." I had seen him before, always too close to her, always smiling like he owned the place. Damien said, "If you keep trusting me, I'll make you richer than ever." Vivian replied, "I trust you more than anyone here." I felt my heart drop. Damien joked, "Even more than your boyfriend?" Vivian paused, then said, "He's different." Damien laughed and said, different means easy to forget. Vivian didn't correct him. I pushed the door open and said, easy to forget, huh? Vivian turned and her face went cold, like a wall sliding back into place. Damien smirked at me and said, oh, you must be Ethan. I said, and you must be the man who makes her laugh. Vivian snapped, you shouldn't be here. Those words hit me harder than any insult. I asked, why not? She said, this is a private meeting. I looked at Damien and said, private enough to joke about me? Damien leaned back and said, relax, we were just talking business. I replied, business doesn't sound like that. Vivian said, Ethan, don't make this awkward. I said, I didn't, you did. She crossed her arms and said, you're overreacting. I asked, did you laugh like that with me? She didn't answer. Damien stood up and said, I should leave you two alone. I said, no, stay, I want to hear what else is funny. He smiled and said, you really don't. Vivian looked away and said, this isn't what it looks like. I replied, then what is it? She said, it's complicated. I said, love shouldn't be. I turned to Damien and said, do you enjoy standing between people? He said, I enjoy winning. That was all I needed to hear. I looked at Vivian and said, is this what winning looks like to you? She said, you're being unfair. I whispered, you're being cruel. I walked out without waiting for another excuse. Sophie followed me and said, Ethan, I'm sorry. I said, don't be, at least you tried. She said, I didn't want you to see it like that. I replied, I needed to see it. Outside, I sat in my car and said to myself, so that's the truth. My phone buzzed, but I didn't look. I drove home and replayed every moment Vivian had pushed me aside. I said out loud, I was never her first choice. That thought hurt more than the scene I had just watched. When night came, I stared at the ceiling and said, how long was I just an option? I remembered her cold voice saying, you shouldn't be here, and it felt like a door slamming in my chest. I whispered, I loved you. No one answered. I realized then that I had been standing outside her heart the whole time, pressing my face to glass, hoping she would let me in. But she had been inside laughing with someone else and I had finally heard it. I ran into Lena Hart outside a small cafe and said, I didn't expect to see you here. She smiled gently and replied, life has a strange sense of timing. I tried to sound normal and said, you still drinking too much coffee? She laughed and said, some habits never change. I looked at her and felt something steady in my chest that I hadn't felt in weeks. She asked, are you okay? I said, I'm fine. She shook her head and said, that was the fastest lie I've heard today. I sighed and said, I'm just tired. She replied, then sit with me. I sat and said, you always make it sound simple. She said, sometimes it is. I stared at my cup and said, I think I'm losing someone I love. She asked softly, who? I said, Vivian. Lena nodded and said, the CEO? I said, the woman who doesn't know how to love. She said, that sounds lonely. I replied, it is. Lena said, do you want advice? I said, no, I just want someone to listen. She said, then talk. I took a breath and said, we feel like strangers who share a title. She asked, does she know you feel that way? I said, I think she knows, she just doesn't care. Lena said, you look like you've been carrying this alone. I replied, because I have. She said, you don't have to. I looked at her and said, you always say things that make me want to believe. She smiled and said, belief is free. My phone buzzed and I said, it's Sophie. Lena asked, who is that? I replied, Vivian's assistant. I read the message and said, she wants to meet. Lena said, that doesn't sound small. I said, nothing about Vivian ever is. Sophie wrote, be careful with Damien. I typed, what do you mean? She replied, he isn't just a business partner. I felt my stomach twist and said, that's not comforting. Sophie wrote, he ruins people. Lena watched my face and asked, what happened? I said, someone just warned me. She said, about what? I replied, about the man who keeps standing between me and Vivian. Lena said, that sounds dangerous. I said, so does love right now. I leaned back and said, I feel trapped between what I want and what I know. Lena said, which one hurts more? I replied, both. She said, you deserve honesty. I said, I don't think I'm going to get it. Lena reached across the table and said, you're allowed to be hurt. I felt my throat tighten and said, no one ever tells me that. She replied, then listen now. I said, I keep fighting for someone who wouldn't fight for me. Lena said, then maybe stop. I asked, what if I lose everything? She said, what if you lose yourself? I looked at her and said, you make it sound so clear. She smiled sadly and said, it's only clear because I'm not inside your heart. I said, I want to walk away clean. She said, that takes courage. I whispered, I don't feel brave. She replied, you don't have to feel brave to be brave. My phone buzzed again and I said, Vivian wants to know where I am. Lena asked, what will you tell her? I said, the truth. She said, which is? I replied, that I needed a friend. Lena stood up and said, then go be honest. I said, thank you for not trying to fix me. She smiled and said, you don't need fixing. I walked away feeling lighter and heavier at the same time, knowing I was done begging for love, even if the world wasn't done testing me. I met Lena for coffee and said, this is just two tired people talking. She smiled and replied, that's all I promised. I stared into my cup and said, my head feels loud today. She said, then let it be loud here. I nodded and said, I don't want to fall apart in front of you. She reached out and said, you don't have to be strong with me. I looked down and she was still holding my hand. I whispered, this isn't what it looks like. She said, it looks like someone hurting. I didn't notice the camera but it noticed us. The next morning my phone exploded. I said, what is happening? Lena texted, have you seen the news? I replied, no. She wrote, there's a photo of us everywhere. I opened it and said, they made it look like we're together. Lena wrote, they're lying. A knock slammed against my door. Vivian's voice cut through and said, open this right now. I opened it and said, Vivian, wait. She stormed in and said, so this is how you repay me? I asked, repay you for what? She held up her phone and said, for embarrassing me. I said, you didn't even ask what happened. She replied, I don't need to, I can see it. I said, you see a picture, not the truth. She said, the truth is you were holding her hand. I answered, I was falling apart. Vivian crossed her arms and said, you're my boyfriend. I replied, you never act like I'm yours. She said, this isn't about feelings, this is about respect. I said, respect goes both ways. She stepped closer and said, did you cheat on me? I asked, did you ever choose me? She said, don't twist this. I replied, I'm tired of being twisted. Vivian said, you made me look weak. I said, you made me feel worthless. She raised her voice and said, you humiliated me. I whispered, you abandoned me. She said, I gave you everything. I laughed and said, you gave me a schedule. She said, you should be grateful. I snapped, where was this passion when I was begging for your attention? Vivian froze. Her eyes shook and I finally saw fear there. She said, you don't understand. I replied, I understand loneliness. She took a breath and said, that woman wants you. I said, she listens to me. Vivian said, I don't have time for that. I replied, that's the problem. She looked at me and said, I won't lose you. I asked, do you even know who I am? She said, you're mine. I said, I'm not a contract. Vivian pulled out her phone and said, I can end this story right now. I said, you mean silence me? She said, I mean protect us. I replied, you mean control me? She stepped back and said, you belong with me. I whispered, I belong to myself. Her jaw tightened and she said, you're making a mistake. I said, so are you. She turned toward the door and said, this isn't over. I replied, it never is with you. When she left, I sat down and said, one photo showed more truth than all our years together. I walked into my office and Mark Bell said, Ethan, close the door. I asked, why do you look scared? He whispered, because powerful people made calls. I said, about me? He nodded and said, about you and your girlfriend. I replied, so she's using work now. My phone buzzed and Vivian said, come see me. I answered, you already sent your message. She said, this is business. I said, that's what scares me. When I met her, she said, I can fix everything. I asked, at what price? She replied, move in with me and stop seeing Lena. I laughed and said, you say that like you're buying furniture. She said, I'm protecting you. I said, you're owning me. Vivian said, you belong with me. I replied, you sound like a contract. She said, love needs structure. I said, love needs choice. Sophie texted, meet me now. I met her in a quiet hallway and said, what's wrong? She whispered, Damien is pushing Vivian into something dangerous. I asked, what kind of dangerous? She said, the kind that destroys people. I said, why tell me? She replied, because I tried to warn you before and I was scared. I asked, of losing your job? She nodded and said, and myself. I felt torn and said, if I tell the truth, her world burns. Sophie said, if you don't, you will. Vivian called again and said, did you decide? I replied, I decided not to be owned. She said, you're being stubborn. I said, I'm being free. She snapped, you belong with me. I answered quietly, no, I belong to myself. That was the moment I stopped being afraid. I was sitting alone when Nina Park called and said, I need to ask you some questions. I replied, I don't want to be part of this. She said, you already are. I asked, about what? She answered, about Damien and his secret deal. I said, I don't trust reporters. Nina replied, you shouldn't, but you should trust documents. She sent me files and said, look at where the money went. I stared at the screen and said, that's Vivian's name. Nina said, Damien used it to hide. I called Lena and said, I think something bad is happening. She asked, do you want help? I said, I need truth. She replied, then send me everything. I waited while Lena read and said, this could ruin Vivian. I whispered, or save her. Lena said, or both. My phone rang and Vivian said softly, I need you. I froze and said, why now? She replied, everything is falling apart. I said, it always was. She whispered, please come. I answered, I won't be your shelter if I'm not your partner. She said, I don't understand. I replied, that's the problem. Later she called again and said, Damien is lying to me. I said, I know. She asked, how? I said, because he's been using you. Vivian met Damien and called me, her voice shaking. She said, he's not who he pretends to be. I replied, you finally see it. She said, he threatened me. I whispered, that's his real face. She cried and said, I trusted him. I answered, you ignored everyone else. She said, I lost you. I replied, you let me go. For the first time, I heard regret instead of control. I watched the news on my phone and said, so this is how it ends. Lena stood beside me and asked, are you okay? I replied, I don't know what okay means anymore. She said, you don't have to be strong right now. My phone rang and Vivian said, please meet me. I hesitated and said, where? She whispered, anywhere you want. When she arrived, I barely recognized her. I said, you look scared. She replied, I am. I asked, where is Damien? She said, he disappeared. I replied, he always does when things go wrong. Vivian said, the board turned on me. I answered, you trusted the wrong man. She said, I trusted no one. I replied, you trusted power. She looked at me and said, I used control because I was afraid. I said, afraid of what? She replied, of needing you. Lena stood quietly and Vivian glanced at her. Vivian said, she listens to you. I answered, she treats me like a human. Vivian whispered, I hated how much I needed you. I said, so you punished me for it. She cried and said, I didn't know how to love. I said, it cost me everything. She asked, what do you mean? I replied, it cost me my confidence, my pride and my peace. Vivian reached out and said, I'm sorry. I stepped back and said, sorry doesn't heal loneliness. She whispered, I'll change. I replied, you already lost me. She looked at Lena again and said, you look happy with him. Lena said softly, he looks alive. Vivian turned to me and said, did you ever love me? I answered, I loved who I thought you were. She asked, do you still? I replied, no. She asked quietly, did I ever love you? I said, did you? She opened her mouth then closed it. That silence was louder than any apology. I woke up to a message from Sophie and she wrote, it's done. I asked, what is? She replied, Damien is exposed. I said, did you do it? She wrote, I sent Nina the proof. I typed, thank you for choosing the truth. She answered, I was tired of being afraid. I opened the news and said, so that's how karma sounds. Lena looked at me and asked, "Do you feel relief?" I replied, "I feel quiet." She said, "Quiet can be healing." Vivian sent me a letter, not a message, not a call, just paper. I said, "She finally learned how to be slow." Lena asked, "Will you read it?" I nodded and said, "I need to." I opened the letter and whispered, "Dear Ethan." I kept reading and said, "I am sorry for treating you like a tool instead of a heart." I paused and said, "That already feels different." I continued, "I don't expect you to come back." I said, "That feels honest." Lena asked, "What else?" I replied, "She says she lost everything except the truth." Lena said, "That's a start." I folded the letter and said, "She finally spoke like a human." Lena smiled and said, "You deserve that." I replied, "I deserve better." I walked outside and said, "I'm not angry anymore." Lena asked, "What are you?" I said, "Free." I looked at the sky and said, "I don't win by destroying her." Lena said, "You win by choosing yourself." I smiled and said, "I'm done begging to be loved." I took a step forward and said, "This is my life now.